Welcome everyone to our Evaluate webinar on orphan drugs. Are they losing their sparkle? My name is Rebecca Brooks and I'm the events manager at Evaluate. Before we get started, we have a few reminders. You can ask questions throughout the webinar by using the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will endeavour to answer them during the discussion. Any questions we don't get to, we will send out further information following the webinar. Our team is also on hand for any technical questions you have. The webinar is being recorded and we will send you the link to access the on-demand version and a copy of the slides after the event. I'm delighted to introduce our panel for today. Melanie Senior is a healthcare writer and analyst and is the author of Evaluate's recently published report on orphan drugs. Stephanie Lauzon is Managing Director for Biopharma Healthcare at Stifel International, and Purugar is Senior Commercial Analyst at Evaluate. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Melanie to set out some of the context for the report and who will be chairing our discussion for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Great to be here. Thank you all for coming. So, yeah, it's a question we'll be asking during our discussion. Are orphan drugs losing their sparkle? We're armed with Evaluate's latest 5-year data, forecast data for orphan drugs. This is still a very shiny category indeed, growing healthily at about 10% or so per year on average, forecast to generate about $270 billion in aggregate sales by 2028. For context, that's about a fifth of the overall prescription drug market. And that share has doubled over the past decade. So there's a lot that's very, very healthy indeed. However, the orphan growth is forecast to slow, not very much, but down to the high single digits rather than low double digits. And therefore, the growth gap, if you like, to the non-orphan category will narrow. Reasons for this, well, many of the headwinds we've already highlighted before, they're still stubbornly in place, some of them getting stronger. We've seen over the last couple of years, at least, a shift in interest and appeal activity towards so-called big drugs for big diseases. Of course, most obviously obesity, where some very big products from Novo and Lilly in particular, with forecast sales in this time period, sort of up to 80 or 90 billion just between those. But also other, widespread conditions, whether it's inflammation, cardiovascular disease, immunology, some aspects of CNS, really regaining attention. And, this is in large part because big pharma buyers still face, here's another theme, is the patent cliffs. We've seen these throughout the decade. There's still quite a lot more to come. And these large sales losses are forecast, well over $100 billion in lost sales in the next 5 years. Large gaps mean you need large drugs to fill them. So that, I think, is another headwind as far as the orphan category is concerned, because a lot of the interest, as I say, has gone towards big drugs. And those key patent expiries, we still have Merck's Keytruda to come in 2028. That's their big checkpoint inhibitor. BMS's Opdivo in the same category. So that's very much still a big theme, a big contextual point that's influencing, I think, the orphan drugs category. I've got to mention the Inflation Reduction Act as well. They're not going away. There have been various attempts to quash it, but those haven't succeeded. This, of course, relates to price negotiations by the US CMS, US Medicare. Orphan drugs are exempt from those, but only orphans with a single indication. So many of the orphans have multiple indications, and those are including the very big ones. So they are still at risk. They will fall into the Inflation Reduction Act's crosshairs, where pricing negotiations are concerned. So those are some headwinds. We've got more discerning payers across the board as the number of expensive gene therapy, cell therapies increases, and as the category becomes more price sensitive as a result, has a bigger budgetary impact. And we have more competition, as we'll see in some corners of the orphan drugs market in some categories. Don't weep, though, for orphan drug developers too much. They are still, this is a category that accounts for over half of FDA drug approvals. I think it was almost 60% last year. It's, you know, well over half of all drugs approved in the last 5 years. The biggest drug in the orphan category, J&J's Darzalex blood cancer drug, will sell over 17 billion in the time frame we're talking about, and actually makes it into the top 10 drugs in of all time, orphan or non-orphan. The next three biggest raking in 5 billion or more each in dollars. So it, as you say, still very shiny indeed. We're just talking in relative terms as to whether they may be losing their sparkle. So with all of that said, I'm delighted to have both Stephanie here with us and Puru from Evaluate, first of all, who will run through the data in a little more detail, and then we'll open for a discussion, including to your questions from the audience as well. So over to you, Puru. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today, and thank you, Melanie, for that wonderful introduction. So as Melanie pointed out, the growth of the orphan drug market has really just outpaced that of non-orphan prescription drugs. Last year in 2023, we predicted that 2024 sales would be 195 billion and 300 billion by 2028. We have since reevaluated our estimates in this year's report because we see a multitude of events, such as Melanie pointed out, impacting this market slightly, leading to a revised estimate of 185 billion for 2024 and 270 billion by 2028. Last year, we projected that the sales of this particular category would grow almost 12% between the years 2023 all the way up to 2028. However, this year, as Melanie pointed out, that this year the growth will barely mark double digits. And one of the big reasons for this is due to the interest in obesity drugs such as Wegovy, Ozempic, Mounjaro, and Zepbound, and other neurology assets as well. According to some estimates, what we're seeing is both the obesity and neurology market could reach well over $100 billion by 2030. And overall, there is sort of a hesitation right now within the industry in the ability to sort of expand these orphan drugs into adjacent indications, again, due to the provisions that are baked into the Inflation Reduction Act. So a lot of these new and emerging blockbusters in immunology and neurology are gaining tractions and R&D dollars. And what we're seeing is immunology in particular is very attractive because it has that pipeline and a product potential. And as we know, pharma is enamored with assets that can expand into adjacent indications and build out a huge brand, such as, you know, what Merck did with Keytruda and so on and so forth. So just 5 days ago, we were just looking at this. Johnson & Johnson acquired Proteologics for about $850 million in cash. And that was its way, you know, it was a strategy to sort of expand into the atopic dermatitis market. And then BMS last year in December, as we know, dropped almost close to $14 billion in acquiring Karuna Therapeutics for its neurology assets, particularly for schizophrenia, which is their drug KarXT. What we're also seeing more broadly is that payers are now sort of resistant to some of the high list prices for these orphan drugs, and they're looking more towards a volume-based approach now, and they're sort of prioritizing a more widespread population, such as what they will get with obesity or neurology. But again, as Melanie pointed out, we shouldn't let this sort of dictate the future of orphan drugs. The market is still very highly attractive. Regulators have shown historical flexibility within this sector. And for the past 5 years, FDA's share of orphan drugs approvals has well exceeded over 50%. Next slide, please. So now we're going to be looking at the top 10 selling orphan drugs in 2028 in terms of sales. Collectively, these drugs are projected to generate over $57 billion by 2028. But I just want to stop here for a second and compare this to the massive $14 billion in sales recorded by Novo in 2023 just for Ozempic alone. And then additionally, Novo raked in $4.5 billion in sales for Wegovy. So we can now kind of see why there's a shift in the industry towards investing in obesity. But nonetheless, the top 3 orphan drugs remain the same from last year, which is Darzalex, Trikafta, and Hemlibra. As you can see, that there's a big gap between Johnson & Johnson's orphan sales and the rest of the pack. The rest of the pack is usually hovering anywhere between 6 to 15%, but Johnson & Johnson has the market lead, clearly mostly due to the success of Darzalex, and potentially because of the pipeline candidate nipocalimab as well. We expect 2028 sales of nipocalimab to total about $737 billion. So it would further propel Johnson & Johnson to continue to be the market leader that it is in this category.
Piru, can I just interrupt a sec? Sorry, it's Mel. That's such an interesting point because, of course, nipocalimab pipeline in a product to your earlier comments about the big drugs for big diseases. Of course, this is happening within the orphan realm as well. But of course, I suppose the collection of diseases are slightly smaller. And as we both mentioned as well, there are now multiple products in some of these corners like myasthenia gravis and neuromuscular disease, where actually nipocalimab has shown its phase 3 results, very strong ones. But of course, it's coming along now in a whole load of other rare diseases, that some of which I can't pronounce, but various inflammatory polyneuropathies, etc. So there is that phenomenon going on in orphans as well. But as you say, all relative. And we talked about Wegovy and Mounjaro. So thank you. Sorry, I just thought I'd come in with that as well.
No worries at all. And we were looking at the data a little bit, and we believe that the market share of Trikafta may erode over time, particularly actually because of Vertex's own triple combo drug, which is the Vanza triple, for cystic fibrosis. So a lot of good things happening for Vertex there, potentially closing in the gap down the line with Darzalex. But Darzalex, has established itself as the front runner in the orphan drug market, as we know. Sales were nearing $9.5 billion, and it has a robust growth rate of about 8%. But this is a notable decline from last year's projection of 11%, so it's dropped a little bit. The patent is set to expire in 2029 for Darzalex, and Johnson & Johnson does sort of face significant hurdles ahead. But one thing we sort of looked at was a pivot strategy. It looks like Johnson & Johnson has responded a little bit by integrating a new ingredient into Darzalex, thus creating a new formulation, which now the drug can be administered through an injection rather than an infusion. And this reclassification in a way might be a strategy to delay the price negotiation ability, potentially, down the line to 2033 or 2034. And the biggest question is, well, are other manufacturers going to follow suit? Is this just sort of a regular life cycle management effort, that we've seen on the non-orphan side, now transitioning on the orphan side? AbbVie's Imbruvica has sort of edged out as well. There's Biogen's Brukinsa that's came into the market now, and it beat Imbruvica in the head-to-head trial in 2022, what we've seen. And this is probably largely due to the greater BTK specificity that the drug has. Imbruvica also, interestingly, kind of fell off of our list, but then it came up on a different list, which is the IRA chopping block. And what we're seeing now is it's up for negotiation. So just curious to kind of see what happens down the line with the negotiations with the government there. Number 5 or number 6 position, we have Jakafi, and the sales sort of boosted over the years. And we anticipate a future boost in sales as well, because the IRA might have a net positive impact for this particular drug because of the $2,000 cap out-of-pocket costs for Medicare Part D patients. So it might boost the sales. I know the manufacturers of Jakafi were targeting about $3 billion in sales in 2028. So I think the IRA might further propel it to actually meet that goal. Next slide, please.
Puru, the other one is, I'll just come in while we move the slides. The IRA is interesting, isn't it? Because as we say in the report, that there are countervailing winds. Some of them are headwinds, some of them are tailwinds, and the Medicare Part D cap is one that may favour Jakafi because it does primarily affect over 65s, the myelofibrosis, which is the condition it treats. And the cap may allow patients who couldn't previously or didn't think they could afford it, to get on and use it. So again, maybe, and I think your earlier point is a good one about the life cycle management strategies. As you say, exactly the same as for non-orphans. Maybe the distinction is less relevant here. There are still massive question marks over whether that life cycle extension strategy, in particular the hyaluronidase addition and making it a longer, allowing it to be an injection rather than infusion, will that skirt the IRA provisions, in the sense that at the moment CMS is saying, any active ingredient, any drug containing the same active ingredient will be grouped collectively as the same drug. So Wegovy with Ozempic, Zepbound with Manjaro. And so obviously you meet then that threshold, that Medicare cost threshold, a lot quicker. And this is what's panicking everyone. They're saying, well, what tweaks can we make to skirt that? But also, as you say, Puru, just general life cycle management strategy. And we're seeing it with Novo and obesity by, creating CagriSema, which adds the amylin analog to semaglutide to try and again take semaglutide out of those IRA crosshairs. So lots of complicated stuff going on and lots of question marks still remaining, I think, around all this. So. Perfect.
And so now we're going to transition over into looking at the worldwide orphan drug prescription sales in 2028. We're going to look at the top 10 companies, and the biggest news of it all is that AbbVie has lost its top 10 spot in 2028's ranking. And this is largely because Amgen has come in and it's forecasted to bring in about $9 billion in orphan sales by 2028. This is a growth rate of about 17%. And again, this is largely due to Amgen's acquisition of $27.8 billion of Horizon Therapeutics in 2022, which brought in Tepezza, which brought in Krystexxa and Uplizna into their portfolio. And Amgen's fourth quarter report, just the recent one, generated revenue of $8.2 billion, and Horizon's products really raked in close to $1 billion out of the $8.2 billion. So it was a good acquisition. As expected, J&J is sort of leading the pack here, and it's going to continue to post, we think, double-digit growth rate of about 12.9%, with 2028 orphan sales totaling about $30.6 billion. Darzalex alone, interestingly, will account for about 47% of sales in that orphan portfolio. And Vertex, even though it placed fifth position, the expected $12 billion of sales in orphan drugs far exceed those of BMS and Pfizer and Sanofi and Takeda as well. Could we transition on to the next slide, please? And last but not least, just wanted to sort of look at the top 5 orphan drugs in 2023. This goes anywhere from phase 3 up to the NDA BLA status. And we're going to look at this in terms of NPV, which is net present value, which evaluates proprietary calculations derived from our own consensus forecast, and it's set against the cost required to achieve these revenues. We were looking at, the Vanza triple, everyone's sort of talking about it. It's poised really to become one of the top selling orphan drugs expected to enter the market. As I previously mentioned, this drug may eventually eat into Vertex's own market share of Trikafta, but as we sort of look into the report, Vertex may not mind this because it would owe substantially less substantially less royalties on this particular drug. So if approved, 2028 sales may reach closer to $1.2 billion, and we're calculating an NPV value just shy of $6 billion. If we look at Amgen's Uplizna, the company is really looking forward to the approval for myasthenia gravis, and this was again through the acquisition of Horizon Therapeutics. So it required that for $27.8 billion, and now it's really looking to have Uplizna sort of come to the forefront. The phase 3 trial for MG is sort of expected to complete anywhere from now and for down to couple of months down the line, and it could really provide some sort of tough competition to nipocalimab as well. And last but not least, Intellia's genome editing drug, which is the NTLA 2001, which is co-developed by Regeneron, could become potentially the first drug to edit cellular genomes within the body. So it will now compete with Pfizer's Vyndamax and the Vincadil family, and potentially also compete with Anilim's next generation RNA interface drug, Amrevota. But just wanted to end on this note that, despite the inherent challenges that this sort of market faces, it still possesses significant growth opportunities for manufacturers while offering renewed hope for patients in need. Just want to say that the demand for these drugs is really more critical now than ever. We have to sort of continue to ensure as an industry that the most vulnerable patients receive the care that they deserve, and a chance for an increased quality of life as well. And I think, investing in these drugs not only just benefits manufacturers and fosters innovation, but it just further strengthens our commitment to addressing unmet needs as an industry. So, and with that, I would just, hand it back over to Melanie for a discussion.
Thanks, Guru. Thanks very much indeed for talking us through that. It's so interesting that, as you talked about some of the in vivo gene editing approaches and these new really exciting modalities, the orphan space is where these, appear first, and that's important. And as well as, of course, the social importance of the category and the remaining unmet needs, of which there is a considerable amount. It was notable as well that Carvykti is in the top 10, and that's, the first CAR T-cell therapy to make it into that category, I think, reflecting the growth of these newer and challenging modalities in many respects, but very important nevertheless. So long overdue. Stephanie, thank you so much for being here with us. Love to hear, your reaction. Are we overplaying this slight drop off in growth of this extraordinary category? Do you think? What are your, what's your perspective on the category, and perhaps, anything you want to add generally before we perhaps look at some more specifics?
I mean, I think I would say that it has been quite a remarkable, series of years of growth, and that kind of thing. Once you reach a certain size, it's hard to keep that going forever. It doesn't mean that the sales aren't growing. It's just maybe on a percentage basis, that it's coming down a bit. I think people are expecting that, at least at the moment, that orphan drugs will sort of stay at around that 20% level. It's just kind of basic math, right? When you reach numbers of this size, to keep propelling at that kind of 20+% growth rate, hard to sustain.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was exactly. It feels as if it's sort of settling down to its level now. This magic 20%, perhaps. Who knows? But I think as the pressure, as the overlap appears to increase, as we've been talking about on so many levels, whether it's exposure to IRA, whether it's life cycle management, patent expiries, it seems the distinction is less relevant for some of these big drugs at the top end of orphans, and the bigger orphans. And that's where I think some of the policy debate comes in as to whether the categorization is out of date now for orphan drugs. And we've discussed this in earlier reports, whether we need a sort of new sort of ultra rare category to really ring fence the smaller products for the really niche diseases. And I don't know, my sense from people I talk to, Stephanie, is that there's very little, if not no chance of any of this sort of legislative changes that some people are calling for to sort of really try and boost the really niche, ultra rare orphans. I don't know hear or know of any differently to that, whether there could be some tweaks to the sort of fundamental categorization of the products?
I mean, I haven't heard anything, in that direction. I mean, they've been trying, right, with the Orphan Cares Act, to try to help protect, the category a little bit. But, time will tell, right, how successful, if at all, that is. But, when you see some of these sales numbers, for each drug, it kind of, maybe is not what people originally intended, when they talked about orphan drugs. So there's, the good news is the category has matured, and it's shown that, there really can be some amazing, dramatic, products that help people. And I think as categories mature, then, certain acceptance of certain, things like, life cycle management or other, that's a sign of maturity, right, of the category. Those kinds of things are coming in.
Absolutely. And maybe to an earlier point, maybe it's a chance for innovation really on the payer side and downstream as to how we increase accessibility, because of course we've seen a lot of the pricing pushback. It has really ramped up, not only because there are just more other big drugs coming in, but also just because we're seeing more rare diseases drugs, more one or two gene therapies. You can say, okay, 1 million, 2 million each, we can afford that for this very small number of patients. But if you have 5 or 6, and if you have 2 gene therapies, as we did last year, approved on the same day for sickle cell disease, which is a rare disorder, but not that rare. I think it's sort of 1 in 500 African Americans suffer with sickle cell disease. So again, rare, but how rare? You see those sort of pressures, and then there's this trend, the need for more innovative contracting, outcomes-based deals, etc. Stephanie, you're probably as frustrated as I am when it comes to these. We never know enough about them, and there aren't ever many of them to talk about. But have you noticed an uptick there, or a sort of groundswell of pricing change, if you like, and new structures around access and outcomes?
Well, I think particularly when you're looking at the US, there's so much variety in terms of plans and coverage and formulary. It's not, there's very little uniformity, so it's actually quite difficult to track that kind of thing. But I mean, I think there has been an increasing trend in outcomes-based pricing, for example, and we've seen some gene therapies go to market with that approach, which especially in orphan products where the prices are can be quite high. It allows payers to set to pay. I mean, these products can be absolutely life-changing and have huge health economic benefits. And when that works brilliantly, I think people are happy to pay for that. But it also, these kinds of approaches can improve patient access because you don't have the initial barriers in place to get them so that patients can get access to the product, and you bring together this sort of risk sharing scenario, which can be very helpful towards getting those products into the market. And also it's a way of really tracking patient outcomes, which is on the one hand a big burden administratively, but also can provide really remarkable real world evidence, which could be quite helpful over time to showing that these products do have a benefit. So, I mean, but as orphan drugs become a bigger percentage or have reached this sort of critical mass, I guess, of the magic 20%, as you said, that the payers, initially, if it was only like, a tiny percentage of their budget, you could sort of let that go. But when we're at this sort of level of overall sales, I think payers are looking more and more at, how can we make sure that this is really, measured and we can control it and, put some restrictions in place, not to, not in an effort to have patients who really need these drugs not be able to access them, but to make sure that they're really being used properly, in well-documented cases, and that the things are really, the data and the outcomes are tracked.
But there is a trade-off, isn't there? Always, of course,
Yeah.
what healthcare you choose to pay for, the very expensive treatments that are life-changing for a small number, or the Wegovy's or the for a large number of people that can reduce risk considerably.
It's also not being paid for gently.
Yeah. No, I've audience questions coming in actually, which is fantastic. And indeed, on that topic, we have a question about the extent to which the competition that myself and Peru alluded to in some of the corners of the market. We've mentioned myasthenia gravis, we mentioned sickle cell, we've got ATTR, which is transthyretin amyloidosis, which is a nasty condition where you get misfolded proteins on the nerves and the heart tissue. There are now more than one product in many of these areas. Are we seeing impact on price? Now, my reaction would be no, not yet, because these products are for the same disorder, but if you look closely, they're often for slightly different patient subgroups within that disorder. And if you're talking about things like gene therapies, if you just take the example of Bluebird's Lyfgenia and Vertex's Casgevy, both approved for sickle cell, these are both products with risk, and there is about $1 million difference in their sticker price. So it's an interesting example of where pricing might play a role. It's 3 million, 2 million. I think Vertex is the cheaper one.
Yeah.
But again, it's such a specialist area, and there are nuances around patients and how many vaso-occlusive events they have, and might be better suited to one or the other. So it's unclear that price, in my opinion, will have a very direct influence. Competition will have a very direct impact on price, at least for the time being, for these kinds of drugs. They are obviously supposedly one-time cures, and the manufacturers will argue that the lifetime costs of care that are saved from having that one-off therapy more than justify the 1 or 2 or 3 million, and that may well square up from a health economic perspective. But as Stephanie alluded to, the practicalities and the administrative reality of payers and budgets and customer retention cycles, etc., in the payer universe means that actually payer X isn't interested in the 10-year savings on a gene therapy for patient, Jim Smith or whatever, because they're not going to see those savings themselves, and that person might move, and etc. So it's a complicated zone. So thank you for that question. Peru, come in, Peru, if you have any comments on any of this, because I've got a couple of other audience questions coming in.
Just wanted to say that it may not have an impact on price, but I'm curious to see what happens down the line with rebates. If instead of changing the list price, if manufacturers are more open to sort of changing the rebate structure of some of these drugs, making it a little bit more lucrative for payers to sort of continue to cover these products.
Yeah, well, that's interesting as well. And you also mentioned volume-based deals, didn't you, in your initial comments? And to Stephanie's point, the overlap between, we're seeing very similar dynamics, for orphans and non-orphans, making some of the distinctions less meaningful. And on that note, another audience question really comes in asking, is the IRA having an impact on orphan drug R&D? So I think to come in, Stephanie and Peru, but I'll just say, first of all, I think industry has made noise about the IRA impacting orphan drug R&D. I remember Al Nilam saying, we're stopping development in I can't remember, Amvuttra, one of them, we're not going to look at it in a second indication, we're dropping that ostensibly because of the IRA. But in reality, I think we need to be careful of reading too much into 1 or 2 examples. I think it's very, very, very difficult to quantify the impact of a still uncertain law, a law that's really only just rolling out, on strategic R&D decisions at this point. industry will say, oh, absolutely, we need to rethink, but is it actually having an impact? I'm not sure that we know the answer to that yet. Definitely, I don't know if your clients, you, without naming names, you have any sort of anecdotal feedback?
Well, I mean, oftentimes, companies will use, a small indication like an orphan indication to generate a human, a clinical proof of concept, and then expand more broadly into, bigger indications once there's some evidence of proof of concept. And I think we're hearing different things. On the one hand, maybe companies are just going to have to do all those things at once and take more risk. Or alternatively, they'll do the orphan trial first or the smaller indication first, but they won't launch, right, until they have the bigger indication ready. So, that's the discussion that we hear, being, bandied about on, really, I mean, I shouldn't say bandied about, really being seriously considered as to what's the best thing to do here, because it's problematic, just given the amounts, at risk from an R&D perspective. And then, to have everything shortened, the cash flow shortened so much really does make a big impact on the net present value discussion and calculation. That's
such an interesting point, actually, Stephanie, and it impacts access, right? If you hold back.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it might, right? It might. Unless companies choose to just do everything at once, in which case the data will come when it comes. But even then, the bigger indications often will have, bigger patient populations and take longer to get the clinical trials done versus the orphan indications, where you can also get accelerated, approval, things like that. So it's difficult.
It's difficult. And actually, funnily, good question from the audience come in, because I was thinking exactly the same thing, which is the impact on smaller companies that would have, who can't afford to do everything at once, and what we therefore might see in terms of earlier M&A or biotech perspective. Yeah. Do you think that could have an implication?
Well, well, you used to see, the biotech company would do the orphan indication first and then partner for the broader market, to the extent there are products that, could have, more than one indication. So it's definitely something, and particularly with capital markets as they are now, which also limits, makes fundraising more complicated. Definitely something that people are thinking about.
Absolutely.
And the other problem is, those last years of cash flow, I mean, it's not all about, cash and money and profit and all those things, but actually losing those last years of cash flow, that's where, those can be, very lucrative. And so they really make people think.
They can be the most important, can't they? Because I think a lot of us fail to appreciate how long it takes to ramp up. How long it takes to get a product established on formulary, get the clinicians used to them, physicians, particularly with these complex modalities, these increasingly specialist treatments that do need a groundswell of knowledge and expertise behind them to really access patients. So, that is an interesting point. I've got a couple of other questions coming in. It was interesting, I think, for all these challenges we talk about and the big drugs for big diseases. AstraZeneca was reporting today or yesterday, and they, very much still rare disease part of the agenda there for them, and I think absolutely remains a really important category, which increasingly considered alongside these other indications that we're hearing more about. Peru, did you have any other comments or thoughts?
No, nothing on this particular topic. No.
Okay, so I think we had another question that we've already answered, I think, which relates to the Orphan Drug Act. I think we've basically covered that off to say, look, it's very unlikely that anything legislative-wise changes in the near term, just because we're still seeing this massive ripples from the Inflation Reduction Act, which hasn't actually, it's in play, but we haven't actually seen the first negotiated prices yet at all. So there's a lot happening there. So I think we're unlikely to see any more legislative tweaking. And then we've of course got, the US election coming up, and I think there's zero chance of anything happening before then. And we'll see after that how the IRA does, how the creases are ironed out, if they're ironed out, and some of the points that Stephanie was mentioning about the impact on revenue streams and later down the line. I think we're just going to have to be, wait to see that and see what industry can do to help maybe fine tune some of the conditions and restrictions there. So in the criteria. So with that, I think I'm going to draw this to a close. I'm going to thank wholeheartedly Peru and Stephanie for going through the data with such insight and such detail, and Stephanie for your contribution to the discussion and your perspective. Thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed the full report, and as Rebecca said, come and be in touch with questions and comments, and we welcome as much feedback as possible. And with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Stephanie.